Kalira knew something was terribly wrong when the ground beneath her feet started shaking for the third time that morning, and she stood in the central garden of her home city, watching the ancient trees sway like they were dancing to music only. They could hear, and her two dragons, Ember and Frost, circled high above with their worried cries, cutting through the air like sharp knives. The elven woman pressed her hand against the trunk of the oldest tree in the garden and felt the vibrations running through it like a heartbeat that was beating too fast, and she remembered what the scientists had told the council just 2 days ago, that the planet core was becoming unstable and that the volcanic systems were waking up after sleeping for 10,000 years, and nobody had expected this to happen so suddenly. She walked quickly toward the communication tower at the edge of the city, with her long silver hair flowing behind her, and her boots making soft sounds on the stone pathway. And when she reached the tower, she climbed the spiral stairs 2 at a time until she reached the control room where 3 other elves were already working at the ancient machines that had connected Silvalore to the galaxy for centuries. The head technician, whose name was Valoran, looked up at her with tired eyes and shook his head before she could even ask the question, and he said the Galactic Council had received all 47 of their distress signals but had not sent a single response. And Kalira felt her stomach twist into a cold knot, because she knew what that silence meant. The council was punishing them for refusing to share the dragon bonding technology, and everyone in the galaxy knew that Silvalore had kept that secret for thousands of years, and the other advanced races had asked many times to learn how elves could bond with dragons and create partnerships that lasted for centuries, but the elven people had always said no, because it was sacred and personal and not something that could be taught like regular science. Now that decision was going to cost them everything, because the planet was dying and nobody was coming to help. And Kalira looked out the window at her beautiful city with its silver towers and hanging gardens and crystal fountains, and knew that in a few weeks it would all be buried under rivers of fire and ash. And the civilization her people had built over millennia would disappear like smoke in the wind. She touched the communication panel and sent out another distress call, even though she knew it was pointless, and she spoke clearly into the device, saying that this was Silvalore requesting immediate evacuation assistance, and that they had 15,000 people who needed rescue, and that their planetary shields were failing and that time was running out, and please would anyone respond to their call for help. The message went out into the darkness of space, and Kalira waited for a response that she knew would never come, and Valoran put his hand on her shoulder and said quietly that maybe they should prepare the evacuation ships they had and try to save as many people as possible, even though their ships were old and slow and could only carry a few hundred at a time, and it would take dozens of trips that they did not have time to make. Kalira nodded and felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall because she was the keeper of the dragon riders, and the people looked to her for strength, and she could not show weakness now, even though her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces and she wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. She was about to leave the tower when Ember suddenly appeared at the window with her red scales glowing bright like hot metal, and the dragon pressed her massive head against the glass and made a sound that meant come quickly. Something important is happening. And Kalira felt the urgency through their bond and ran back down the stairs with Valoran calling after her, asking what was wrong. Outside the tower, Frost was waiting with his ice-blue wings spread wide, and both dragons were looking up at the sky with intensity, and Kalira followed their gaze and saw nothing at first, but then she noticed a small dot that was growing larger and moving fast, and she pulled out her portable scanner and pointed it at the approaching object with her hands shaking slightly. The scanner showed a ship signature that she did not recognize, and it was definitely not from the Galactic Council or any of the advanced races like the Thorians or the Zentari or the Valorians, and the technology readings were strange and primitive, and the ship design was blocky and inefficient. And then the scanner identified the origin, and Kalira felt her breath catch in her throat. It was a human ship, and humans were the newcomers to galactic society, who had only been traveling between stars for about 20 years, and everyone said their technology was backward and their ships were slow, and their understanding of advanced science was like children playing with toys, and most of the elder races barely acknowledged their existence because they thought humans were too young and too ignorant to matter. But this human ship was coming toward Silvalore at a speed that should not have been possible for their technology, and Kalira watched as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel and entered orbit above her planet, and her communication device suddenly buzzed with an incoming message, and she stared at it for a moment before accepting the call. She activated the device with shaking hands and heard a voice speaking in rough but understandable Galactic Standard, and the voice belonged to a woman who said her name was Claire, and she was the captain of the cargo ship Liberty Bell, and she had received the distress signals from Silvalore and wanted to know how she could help and if there were specific coordinates where they needed the ship to land. Kalira stood there in shock, because a human had answered when the entire Galactic Council had turned away, and all the advanced races who claimed to value civilization and progress had ignored their desperate pleas, and she looked at Ember and Frost, and both dragons made sounds that meant they approved of this strange development, and that maybe these humans were worth trusting. She pressed the communication button and said in a voice that trembled slightly that they needed evacuation assistance for 15,000 people, and that the planet was becoming unstable, and that the volcanic systems were about to explode, and that they had maybe 2 weeks at most before Silvalore tore itself apart and became uninhabitable forever. There was a pause, and then Claire responded and said that sounded like a lot of people, but she had already called for backup and 4 more human ships were on their way, and they would figure something out, and they had experience with difficult evacuations, and Kalira wanted to laugh and cry at the same time, because this human captain sounded so casual about attempting the impossible. The Liberty Bell began descending through the atmosphere, and Kalira could see it now with her own eyes, and it was ugly and battered and covered with repair patches and looked nothing like the elegant ships of the advanced races, but it was coming down to help them. And that was all that mattered, and she felt something warm spreading through her chest that she realized was hope. She ran toward the main city square where the ship was obviously heading, and Ember and Frost flew alongside her with their wings creating patterns in the air, and other elves were coming out of their homes and looking up at the sky with confusion and hope mixing together on their faces, and children were pointing at the strange, blocky ship that was getting closer with every passing second. Kalira realized that maybe the humans were not as primitive as everyone thought, and maybe having advanced technology did not mean having an advanced heart, and maybe the youngest race in the galaxy understood something about helping others that the ancient civilizations had forgotten. In their thousands of years of existence and their endless political games and their cold calculations about who deserved help and who did not. The Liberty Bell landed in the square with a loud roar of engines and clouds of dust rising around it, and the cargo bay doors opened slowly, and Kalira saw a woman standing there in a worn flight suit with short dark hair and a confident smile, and Claire waved at her and shouted over the noise asking if she was ready to get started, because they had a lot of work to do. Claire jumped down from the cargo bay with a tablet in one hand and a confident expression on her face, and she walked straight toward Kalira without any hesitation, even though Ember and Frost were circling overhead with their massive wings casting shadows across the square, and most beings in the galaxy would have been terrified to approach a dragon keeper so casually. The human captain stopped a few feet away and extended her hand in what Kalira recognized as a human greeting gesture, and Claire said it was nice to meet her and asked if she was the one in charge of coordinating the evacuation, and Kalira took the offered hand and shook it, feeling the warmth and strength in the human woman's grip. She told Claire that she was the keeper of the dragon riders and that she had been trying to organize something, but their ships were limited and slow, and Claire nodded and said, well, that was why she was here, and that 4 more ships were arriving within the next 6 hours, and they would start loading people as soon as possible. Kalira looked at the Liberty Bell and tried to calculate how many elves could fit inside, and she knew from the scanner readings that it was a cargo vessel not designed for passengers, and she asked carefully how many people the ship could carry, and Claire tilted her head and said probably about 800 if they packed them in tight and used the cargo holds. The elven woman felt her hope begin to crack, because 800 was barely 5% of their population, and even with 5 ships that would only be 4,000 people, and there were 15,000 who needed rescue, and Claire must have seen the despair on her face because she quickly added that they were working on getting more ships and that humans were very good at improvising. Before Kalira could respond, a young elf ran up to them and said that the council wanted to speak with her immediately, and that they were arguing about whether to trust the humans and whether this was some kind of trick, and Kalira felt anger flash through her because the council had time to argue, but not to make actual decisions that would save lives. Claire raised an eyebrow and asked if there was a problem, and Kalira explained that some of the elven leaders were suspicious of human intentions, and did not understand why humans would help them when the advanced races had refused, and Claire laughed and said that was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard because people did not need a reason to help other people who were in trouble. The human captain said she would come with Kalira to talk to the council and explain the evacuation plan, and together they walked through the city streets, with Ember and Frost following overhead, and other elves watching them with curious eyes and whispering to each other about the strange human who had come from the stars to save them. The council building was a tall structure made of white stone and crystal, and inside the main chamber 7 elven leaders sat in a semicircle, and they all turned to look at Kalira and Claire as they entered, and one of the oldest counselors, whose name was Silverine, stood up and demanded to know what was happening and why a human ship had landed without permission. Claire did not wait for Kalira to explain, and instead she stepped forward and introduced herself and said she was here to evacuate as many people as possible before the planet became uninhabitable, and that she had 4 more ships coming and possibly more after that, and that they needed to start organizing people immediately because time was running out. Silverin looked at her with suspicion and asked what the humans wanted in return for this help, and Claire seemed genuinely confused by the question and said they did not want anything except maybe some fuel if the elves could spare it, but honestly that was not important right now, and what was important was getting people to safety. Another counselor named Therion said that humans were known to be cunning, and that perhaps this was a scheme to steal elven technology or learn the secrets of dragon bonding, and Claire laughed again and said that she barely understood her own ship's technology, let alone alien technology, and that she had no interest in dragons except to make sure they had enough room on the cargo ships. Kalira watched the exchange and felt embarrassed by her own people's suspicion, and she spoke up and said that the Galactic Council had abandoned them, and that Claire and her crew were the only ones who had answered their distress calls, and that they should be grateful instead of questioning motives, and Silverin sat down heavily and looked very old and very tired. The elder counselor finally nodded and said that Kalira was right and that they had no choice but to trust the humans, and he asked Claire what she needed from them, and Claire pulled out her tablet and started listing things in a very practical way that made it clear she had done this kind of work before. She said they needed people organized by family groups, and that each person could bring 1 bag of belongings, and that children and elderly should be prioritized for the first ships, and that anyone with medical training should identify themselves because they might be needed during the journey, and that dragon riders should probably go last because their dragons could help with coordination from the air. Council members looked at each other and seemed surprised by how organized and thoughtful Claire's plan was, and Therion asked how long the journey to safety would take, and Claire said it was about 3 weeks to reach human space, and that her ships were not fast but they were reliable, and they had enough food and water for the trip. Kalira asked what would happen when they reached human space, and whether humans would accept 15,000 elven refugees. And Claire shrugged and said that Earth had plenty of room, and that humans were always interested in meeting new people and learning new things, and that there were already several alien communities living on Earth, and they seemed to be doing fine. Silverin stood up again and formally thanked Claire on behalf of the elven people, and said they would begin organizing the evacuation immediately. And Claire nodded and said she would go back to her ship and prepare the cargo holds and make sure her crew was ready to start loading people. As they left the council building, Kalira walked beside Claire and said quietly that she did not understand why humans were doing this. And Claire stopped and looked at her with serious eyes and said that when she was a little girl, her family's home had burned down and strangers had helped them rebuild and given them food and clothes and a place to stay, and she had never forgotten that kindness. The human captain continued walking and said that was just how things worked in her experience, and that people helped each other, because that was what made civilization worth having, and not technology or power or ancient knowledge, but the simple act of caring about whether someone else lived or died. Kalira felt something shift inside her chest, and she realized that humans might be young and their technology might be primitive, but they understood something fundamental that the elder races had lost somewhere in their thousands of years of advancement and political games and careful calculations about who deserved help. They reached the Liberty Bell, and Claire's crew was already setting up loading ramps and organizing the cargo holds, and one of the crew members was a tall woman named Helen who waved at them and shouted that she had cleared space for about 900 people, if they did not mind being cozy. Above them, Ember and Frost landed on top of a nearby building and watched everything with intelligent eyes, and Kaylira could feel through her bond that they approved of these humans and trusted them in a way that surprised her, because dragons were usually very suspicious of new beings. The first group of elven families started arriving at the square with their children and their bags and their scared, hopeful faces, and Claire greeted each one personally and helped them up the loading ramp, and Kaylira stood beside her and directed them in their own language, and together they began the long process of saving a civilization. The 4 additional human ships arrived just as Claire had promised, and Kaylira watched them descend through the atmosphere one by one, and each ship looked different from the others, and none of them were military vessels or fancy passenger ships, but instead they were working ships that had been modified and adapted for this rescue mission. The first to land after the Liberty Bell was a massive mining hauler called the Iron Mountain, and its captain was a woman named Helen who had short, red hair and hands that were scarred from years of working with heavy machinery, and she jumped down from her ship and immediately started directing her small crew to prepare the cargo holds for passengers. Next came a converted transport ship named the Prairie Wind, captained by a quiet woman named Patricia, who had been a teacher before she became a cargo pilot, and she brought blankets and medical supplies that she had collected from other human ships along the way, and she set up a small medical station right there in the city square. The third ship was called the Stellar Drifter, and its captain was a young woman named Rita, who could not have been more than 30 years old, and she had bright eyes and an easy smile, and she told Kaylira that she had heard about the situation and decided to join the rescue because it seemed like the right thing to do. The last ship to arrive was an old military transport that had been retired from service years ago, and its captain was a stern-looking woman named Victoria, who had served in the Human Defense Forces for 20 years, and she said she had pulled the ship out of storage and called in favors from old friends to get it running again. Together, the 5 ships could carry about 4,000 people, and Kaylira felt her heart sink because that was still less than a third of the population, and she stood with Claire watching the other captains organize their crews, and she asked quietly what would happen to the people they could not save. Claire looked at her with understanding in her eyes and said that more ships were coming, and that she had sent messages to every human captain she knew, and that the word was spreading through human space about what was happening on Silvalore, and that humans had a tendency to show up when people needed help. As if to prove her point, a new signal appeared on Kaylira's scanner, and then another, and another, and she looked up at the sky in disbelief as 6 more ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and began descending toward the planet, and Claire grinned and said, "See, I told you humans were good at improvising." The new ships were an odd collection of vessels, including a passenger liner that had been converted to carry cargo and a research ship, and even 2 private yachts whose owners had volunteered them for the evacuation, and Kaylira realized that these humans had simply heard about the crisis and decided to come help without being asked or ordered or paid. By the end of the first day, 11 human ships sat in and around the city, and the evacuation was moving faster than anyone had thought possible, and the human captains worked together with surprising coordination, even though they had never met each other before and came from different parts of human space. Kaylira spent hours moving between the ships and helping families board and translating between the elven refugees and the human crews, and she watched as Claire and the other captains solved problems with creativity and determination, and sometimes just plain stubbornness. When there was not enough room in the cargo holds, Victoria suggested removing some of the non-essential equipment from her ship to make more space, and when families did not want to be separated, Helen reorganized her entire loading plan to keep people together, and when an elderly elf became sick, Patricia set up a proper medical bay in one corner of her ship. The elves began to relax around the humans, and children started playing near the ships and asking the crews questions about Earth and what it was like to live among humans. And the human crew members answered patiently and showed them pictures on their tablets of blue oceans and green forests and cities with buildings that reached toward the sky on. The second day, the ground shaking became worse and a fissure opened up on the eastern edge of the city, and lava began seeping through, and everyone knew that time was running out, faster than they had hoped, and Claire gathered all the captains together and said they needed to speed up the loading process. Rita suggested they work in shifts so the ships could take turns launching and returning, and Victoria said they should start evacuating the other two cities immediately before it was too late. And Helen volunteered to take the Iron Mountain to the northern city, while Patricia took the Prairie Wind to the southern settlement. Kaylira went with Helen to the northern city. And during the flight she sat in the cockpit and watched the human captain work, and Helen talked while she flew and explained that she had 3 children back on Earth and that she could not imagine leaving them behind if her world was dying, and that was why she had to help. The northern city was smaller and many of its residents had already fled south when the earthquake started, but there were still about 2,000 people who needed rescue, and Helen landed the Iron Mountain in the central plaza and started loading people with the same efficient kindness that all the human captains seemed to share. A young elven mother approached Kaylira with a baby in her arms and tears running down her face, and she asked if it was true that the humans were not asking for anything in return. And Kaylira said yes, it was true, and the mother broke down crying and said she did not understand how strangers could be kinder than their own galactic neighbors. Kaylira did not have an answer, except to say that maybe humans understood something that other races had forgotten, and the mother nodded and climbed aboard the ship with her baby held close to her chest, and Helen greeted her warmly and helped her find a comfortable spot in the cargo hold. By the time they returned to the main city, 3 more human ships had arrived, and Claire told Kaylira that the word was spreading faster than she expected, and that captains were coming from all over human space, and some were even bringing extra supplies and fuel to share with the other rescue ships. That night, Kaylira climbed to the top of the communication tower and looked out at the city that was filling with human ships, and she could see the crews working under portable lights as they loaded more people and prepared for another round of launches, and Ember and Frost came to sit beside her, with their wings folded. She thought about the Galactic Council and the advanced races who had refused to help, and she thought about these humans who had dropped everything to come rescue strangers, and she realized that maybe advancement was not measured in technology or lifespan or ancient knowledge, but in the willingness to care about others. Claire climbed up to the tower and sat down next to her, and they did not speak for a long time, and finally, Kaylira said thank you, in a voice that was thick with emotion, and Claire put her arm around the elven woman's shoulders and said that was what neighbors were for, even if they had never met before. Below them, the city continued to shake, and more fissures were opening in the ground, and smoke was rising from the distant mountains, but the human ships kept working and kept loading people, and Kaylira knew that they were going to save everyone and that this impossible rescue was actually going to succeed. She looked at Claire and asked how humans had learned to be like this, and Claire was quiet for a moment, and then she said that humans had spent a long time being cruel to each other and fighting wars and making mistakes, and that somewhere along the way they had decided to be better and to help, instead of hurt. The human captain stood up and stretched and said they should get some rest because tomorrow was going to be another long day, and Kaylira followed her down from the tower, and as they walked through the streets, filled with human ships and rescued elves, she felt something she had not felt in weeks, and it took her a moment to recognize. It is hope. On the 5th day of the evacuation, Kaylira woke up to the sound of alarms blaring across the city, and she ran to the window of her quarters and saw orange light glowing on the horizon where the eastern mountains had finally erupted, and columns of ash were rising into the sky like dark fingers reaching toward the stars. She grabbed her communication device and called Claire, who answered immediately, and said she had already seen the eruption and that they needed to accelerate the evacuation timeline, because the volcanic activity was spreading faster than the scientists had predicted, and they probably had 3 days at most before the main city became too dangerous. Kaylira rushed to the city square where the human ships were already preparing for emergency launches, and she found Claire standing with the other captains looking at a holographic map that showed the spreading lava flows, and the captain of the Liberty Bell was directing ships to different locations and telling everyone to double their loading capacity. Victoria said her military transport could take more people if they removed the remaining equipment, and Rita volunteered to make an extra trip even though her ship's engines were starting to show signs of strain. And Helen said she knew a shortcut through an asteroid field that could save them 6 hours on the return journey. Patricia pulled Kalira aside and said they had a problem because there were still about 4,000 people in the southern city and the lava flows were moving in that direction, and they needed to evacuate that settlement immediately before it was cut off. And Kalira felt her stomach drop, because the southern city was where most of the dragon riders lived. She called Ember and Frost, who came immediately, and she explained the situation, and both dragons made sounds of alarm, because many of their kind were in the southern settlement, and Kalira told Claire that she needed to go there personally to coordinate. The dragon riders and Claire nodded and said she would send 3 ships with her. Helen volunteered the Iron Mountain, and Rita insisted on coming with the Stellar Drifter and a new captain named Linda, who had just arrived with a passenger ship called the Horizon Runner, said she would join them, and together the 4 ships lifted off and flew south, while Kalira rode on Ember's back with Frost flying alongside. From the air, Kalira could see how bad the situation had become, and the planet was tearing itself apart with fissures opening everywhere, and geysers of steam shooting up from the ground, and the beautiful forests she had known all her life were burning and turning to ash. The southern city was in chaos when they arrived, and people were running through the streets with their belongings, and dragons were circling overhead with their riders trying to maintain order. And Kalira landed in the main plaza and immediately started organizing the dragon riders into groups. She explained that the human ships had come to evacuate everyone, but that the dragons would need to fly alongside the ships, because there was not enough room inside for the massive creatures, and the riders looked uncertain because they had never trusted their dragons to fly in formation with alien spacecraft before. An older dragon rider named Tellerin approached her and said that some of the riders were refusing to leave because they did not want to abandon their ancestral home, and they would rather die on Silvalore than live as refugees on a human world. And Kalira felt anger flash through her at such foolish pride. She climbed onto a fountain in the center of the plaza so everyone could see her, and she raised her voice and said that Silvalore was already dead, and that staying here would not honor their ancestors, but would instead waste the sacrifice that the humans were making to save them, and that true courage was accepting help and building something new. Tellerin listened to her words, and then nodded slowly and called out to the other riders that Kalira was right, and that they should trust these humans who had shown more loyalty to them than their own galactic allies. And one by one the resistant riders agreed to evacuate. The 3 human ships landed, and Helen jumped out first and started directing people toward the loading ramps, and Rita organized the families with children, and Linda set up a medical station for anyone who was injured or sick, and they worked with the same efficient kindness that Kalira had come to expect from humans. But then the ground shook violently, and a massive fissure opened right through the middle of the plaza, and people screamed and scattered, and Kalira saw a young, elven girl fall into the crack, and without thinking she dove forward and caught the child's hand and held on with all her strength. Helen ran over and grabbed Kalira's other hand, and together they pulled the girl up from the fissure, and the child was crying and terrified but unhurt. And her mother came running and took her and held her close and thanked them over and over, through her tears. Claire's voice came through Kalira's communication device saying that the main city was also experiencing major seismic activity, and that all ships needed to complete their loading within the next 2 hours and get off the planet before the situation became impossible. Kalira looked at the thousands of people still waiting to board and knew they would never make it in time with just 3 ships, and she was about to call for more help when she heard a sound like thunder, and looked up to see 5 more human ships dropping out of the sky. The new arrivals included 2 cargo haulers and a mining ship and even a luxury yacht, whose owner had stripped out all the fancy furniture to make room for refugees, and the captains called down that they had heard the emergency broadcast and came as fast as they could, with 8 ships working together. The evacuation went faster, and Kalira moved between the loading ramps, helping people board and calming frightened children and coordinating with the dragon riders who were preparing their mounts for the flight to safety. Rita came running up to her and said there was a problem because an elderly elf named Morian refused to leave without his collection of ancient books that documented elven history for the past 3,000 years, and the books were too heavy and would take up space needed for people Kalira started to say they would have to leave the books behind, but Rita held up her hand and said, "Wait a minute," and ran back to her ship and returned with several crew members who carried empty cargo containers, and Rita said they would make room somehow because history was important and should not be lost. They loaded Morian's books into the containers and secured them in a corner of the stellar drifter, and the old elf had tears running down his face as he thanked Rita and said that humans understood the value of preserving the past even when the present was falling apart. The last group of elves boarded the ships, just as another massive earthquake struck, and pieces of buildings began falling, and Helen shouted that they needed to leave immediately, and all 8 ships lifted off together with their engines roaring and their cargo holds packed with refugees. Kalira flew beside them on Ember with Frost and dozens of other dragons following in formation, and she looked back one last time at the southern city and saw it disappear under a wave of lava and ash. And she felt grief for everything they were losing, but also gratitude for everything they had saved. The ships climbed through the atmosphere and broke free into space, and Kalira could see Silvalore below them as a beautiful dying world, covered in orange and red and black, and she pressed her face against Ember's scales and let herself cry for the home she would never see again. Then Claire's voice came through the communication system and said that everyone had made it, and that all 15,000 elves were now safely aboard the human ships, and that they were setting course for Earth, and Kalira realized that impossible had just become possible because humans had refused to accept that some people were not worth saving. She guided Ember to fly alongside the Liberty Bell, and through the cockpit window, she could see Claire at the controls, and the human captain looked over and saw her and smiled and gave her a thumbs-up gesture. And Kalira returned it and felt something warm and strong growing in her chest that she recognized as friendship. The fleet of human ships and elven dragons turned away from the dying planet and began the long journey toward Earth. And Kalira knew that they were not just refugees, but the beginning of something new and something better, built on the foundation of human compassion and elven resilience. The journey to Earth took 3 weeks, and during that time, Kalira learned more about humans than she had learned about any species in her 200 years of life, and she spent most of her time aboard the Liberty Bell with Claire and her crew, and she watched how they treated the elven refugees with dignity and patience even when resources were stretched thin. The human ships traveled in a loose formation through space with the dragons flying alongside in shifts because even bonded dragons needed rest, and Ember and Frost took turns sleeping in the specially modified cargo bay that Claire had cleared for them, and the other dragon riders did the same with their mounts. On the 5th day of the journey, Kalira was in the cargo hold helping distribute food rations when a young elven boy asked her if Earth would be like Silvalore, and she had to tell him honestly that she did not know, because she had never been to a human world, and the boy looked scared until Claire overheard and came over. The human captain knelt down beside the boy and pulled out her tablet and showed him pictures of Earth with its blue oceans and green continents and white clouds, and she told him about forests and mountains and rivers and cities where people from dozens of different species lived together in peace. The boy asked if there would be other children to play with, and Claire laughed and said that Earth had billions of people, including millions of children, and that humans loved making new friends and learning about different cultures, and that he would probably have more friends than he knew what to do with. Kalira watched this interaction and felt something shift in her understanding, because Claire did not have to take time to comfort a scared child, but she did it anyway, and she did it with genuine warmth and care, and Kalira realized that this was just how humans were built. On the 10th day they received a message from the Galactic Council, and Kalira felt her blood run cold when she saw the official seal appear on the communication screen, and she called Claire to the bridge and they listened together, as a Thorian counselor delivered a formal statement. The counselor said that the council had been monitoring the situation on Silvalore, and that they regretted the loss of the planet, but that they had concerns about humans transporting such a large refugee population without proper authorization, and that there would need to be diplomatic discussions about the elves' final destination. Claire listened to the entire message with her arms crossed, and when it finished, she hit the reply button, and her response was short and clear, and she said that the elves were going to Earth, and that was final, and that if the council had wanted a say in the matter, they should have answered the distress calls when it actually mattered. The human captain added that Earth was claiming the elven refugees under human protection, and that any attempt to interfere would be considered a hostile act. And then she ended the transmission without waiting for a response, and Kalira stared at her in shock, because no one spoke to the Galactic Council that way. Claire turned to her and said that humans had a saying about actions speaking louder than words, and that the Council had shown through their silence what they valued, and humans had shown through their actions what they valued. And that was the end of the discussion, as far as she was concerned. Word of the exchange spread through all the ships, and the elven refugees talked about it in quiet voices, and Kalira heard many of them say that they had been wrong about humans, and that perhaps the youngest race in the galaxy understood honor better than the ancient ones. On the 15th day, they crossed into human space, and Kalira stood on the bridge of the Liberty Bell, watching the stars and feeling both nervous and hopeful about what came next. And Claire came to stand beside her and said that Earth was still a week away, but that they were safe now. The human captain explained that Earth's government had already prepared a settlement area in a region with good climate and plenty of space, and that there were volunteers organizing supplies and building temporary housing, and that humans were actually excited about having elven neighbors. Kalira asked why humans were so different from the other spacefaring races, and Claire thought about it for a moment and said that maybe it was because humans remembered what it was like to be alone and scared, and that not so long ago they had been the ones who needed help, and someone had given it to them. She told Kalira about how 50 years earlier, when humans had first developed faster than light travel, their colony ship had broken down in deep space, and a passing Zentari vessel had rescued them, even though the two species had never met before, and that act of kindness had shaped how humans thought about their place in the galaxy. On the 20th day, Earth appeared on the view screen as a beautiful blue and green sphere hanging in the darkness, and Kalira called all the dragon riders together, and they guided their mounts to fly in formation around the ships as they approached the planet, and it was a sight that made even the human crews stop and stare. They descended through Earth's atmosphere, and Kalira saw oceans that were actually blue, unlike Silvalor's purple seas, and forests that were green instead of silver, and mountains that were brown and gray instead of crystal. And everything was different, but also somehow welcoming. The ships landed in a wide valley surrounded by gentle hills, and when the cargo doors opened, Kalira stepped out onto Earth, soil for the first time, and felt the warm sun on her face, and smelled air that was rich with unfamiliar scents of growing things, and she heard birds singing in the nearby trees. Thousands of humans were waiting to greet them, and they had set up tents and tables with food and medical stations and welcome signs written in both English and Galactic Standard, and children were running around with excitement and pointing at the dragons and asking their parents if they could pet them. Claire stood beside Kalira and gestured at the crowd and said, "Welcome home." And Kalira felt tears running down her face because she realized that home was not a place, but the people who cared whether you lived or died, and by that definition, Earth was already home. The elven refugees spread out into the valley, and humans came forward to help them and show them where things were. And Kalira watched as barriers of language and culture dissolved in the face of simple human kindness, and she saw elven children laughing with human children and elderly elves being helped to comfortable seats by human volunteers. Ember and Frost landed beside her, and she put her arms around both of them, and they made sounds of contentment because they could feel through the bond that she was finally at peace. And the three of them stood there watching as two very different peoples began the process of becoming neighbors and friends. Later that evening, Claire found Kalira sitting on a hill overlooking the valley and sat down beside her, and they watched the sun set over their new home. And Claire said that she was glad things had worked out, and Kalira said she was too, and that she would never forget what humans had done for her people. The human captain shrugged and said that was just what neighbors did, and that she hoped the elves would do the same for someone else someday. And that was how civilization really worked, by passing kindness forward, like a torch being handed from one person to another across the darkness. Kalira looked at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and thought about the Galactic Council and their cold calculations and political games, and she realized that they had lost something important in their thousands of years of advancement, and humans with their primitive technology and short lifespans had somehow kept it. She turned to Claire and said that elves lived for about 500 years, and that she intended to spend the rest of hers making sure that humans were recognized as the best of what the galaxy had to offer. And Claire laughed and said that was a nice thought. But really, she just hoped they could be good neighbors. Below them, the valley was filling with lights as the humans set up generators and the elves began settling into their temporary homes, and dragons circled overhead keeping watch, and somewhere, someone started playing music and the sound drifted up the hill, and Lyra realized that this was what hope sounded like. She looked at Claire and said thank you one more time, and Claire smiled and said anytime. And they sat together watching the stars come out over Earth and thinking about all the tomorrows that were now possible because humans had refused to accept that some people were not worth saving, and that simple act of defiance had changed everything.